Make sure to check out the previous video in this series, link in the description. G'day guys, before we get started today, please remember to caress that like button and click the subscribe button and of course the real subscribe button being the notification bell. Before we get started, I want to give a special thanks to our patrons Skulk Queen and The Curator. If you want to become a patron, you can check out the link to my Patreon in the description. Now, let's get on to the episode. Josh screamed and kicked as hard as he could to shake free from the monster. Its wormy fingers held a fistful of his hair as it dragged him and his little sister behind it. The young boy tried grabbing at the thing's arm, scratching at it, anything to try and escape. But it wouldn't give. It could have at least dragged him by his arm or his shirt, but by the hair? It seemed pointlessly cruel, as he felt like his scalp was going to be torn off his skull. Josh tried to look over to his little sister and cringed when he saw that this journey had rubbed her back raw. A sick trail of blood was now left on the grass and gravel behind her. She too was screaming and thrashing, but even with her and Josh's combined struggle, the monster seemed unfazed. Becca, are you okay? Can you speak? Josh was terrified that his sister's injuries were worse than they looked. Thankfully though, Becca was somewhat responsive, though her voice was raspy after all her screaming. Josh, I'm scared. I want to go home. Good, me too. So just keep kicking, kick harder, get this damn thing off us. The siblings had their pitiful second wind, but still, the monster didn't care. Eventually they reached the edge of a forest, and finally, that burning, hair-pulling feeling stopped as the monster let both Josh and Becca go. But Josh hadn't expected to be let go so suddenly, and his head dropped, cracking to the ground hard. A muscle in his neck panged as it tore. He winced, trying to suck in air, but winded, it was hard. He saw Becca out of the corner of his eye and rigidly tried turning his head to see her better. She was moving, barely, as she too looked as if she was trying to pull herself together. Josh wanted to get her attention, get her talking, but suddenly the monster appeared inches from his face. There was no texture or detail to the thing's head. It was like a smooth black mass, save for its piercing white eyes. Eyes that tore through him. Josh felt like his head would explode as the extreme amount of blood pumping through him was now throbbing in his ears. The monster reached a hand for Josh's ankle, and in an effortless motion, closed its fist, crushing the bones. His feet, now just like meaty socks filled with stones. It goes without saying that Josh screamed and cried. He was helpless. Just how the monster wanted him. Once it was sure he couldn't run off, the monster turned its attention to Becca. Get away from her! Josh cried. The monster plucked her up and began to climb a nearby tree. Its body shouldn't have moved like that. No. It couldn't have moved like that. Josh watched in speechless horror as it disappeared up the tree with his sister. He heard a rustling in the branches, and Becca let out a short, sharp scream. Then a scrunching sound, and then silence. Wet droplets sprinkled down onto Josh's face as he tried to pull himself along. Becca! Becca, talk to me! What's happening? At last, his eyes began to adjust to the dark, and as he looked up the tree, he could just make out the silhouette of his little sister, impaled on the highest branch. He wanted to shriek and vomit, but in a flash, the monster landed in front of him, jumping down from the tree. But even with its impact on the soil, there was no shaking, there was no sound. It seemed weightless. It looked down at Josh with those white eyes and grabbed his hair again. No! Josh felt the fight drain from him as the monster dragged him, limp, into the black of the forest. After a short while, they stopped again, and the monster lifted Josh up and propped him against a tree. He was going to die. It was going to impale him, just like Becca, and then it was going to do what? Eat the flesh from his bones? He was dead. But curiously, he wasn't. The monster loomed over him, as if waiting for something. Now, barely making a sound and coming to the reality of his imminent death, Josh looked to his ruined feet, waiting for the thing to kill him. But instead, it pushed him expectantly, like an ape playing with its food. Josh stayed quiet and quivering. The monster squatted down in front of him, its eyes so close to his again. It pushed him once more and stared. Josh was confused. What do you want from me? He whispered. The monster stood, looked to Josh's leg, and stomped down hard on his knee, the bone making a sickening pop as it and the tissue around it were ground in seconds. Josh wailed. He sounded like some sort of squealing piglet. And with that, the monster moved away triumphantly. It wanted him to cry, to keep making noise. Even through the intense pain, a glimmer of hope sparked in Josh's chest. The monster wanted something. And if it wanted something from him, that meant it had a reason to keep him alive. So as best he could, Josh tried to maintain some sort of a whimper for as long as possible. Hours turned into a day, and all the while the monster made sure to keep Josh crying, but also kept him fed, regularly stuffing berries and the like down his throat. Josh! It was on the third day that the search party had caught up, and the familiar sound of his dad's voice made him wish he could jump up and run to him. He weakly looked around and smiled when he saw his dad come out from the tree line. Pale horror, but also relief, was written all over his father's face. The desperate man ran to his son and wrapped his arms around him. Oh, I was so scared, boy. I found your sister and I'm just happy you're okay. Josh nuzzled into his father's neck as best he could, getting a noseful of his cheap deodorant, that universal dad smell. But then, the sound of a twig snapped, and Josh opened his eyes to see the monster now standing behind his father. Before he even had a chance to open his mouth to scream, the monster grabbed his dad by the head and flung him into a nearby tree. Josh winced as he heard his father's back snap. But he was still alive, and the man tried to crawl towards his son. The monster rolled him over, and without looking back to Josh, made a guttural cry crunching sound as a jaw unhinged from its smooth black head. Then, in a flash, it chomped down hard on his father's face. "Dad, no!" The man wasn't crying anymore. He now just made guttural sounds with the front part of his brain gone. A vegetable. But the monster wasn't done yet. It leant down to the exposed brain tissue, seeming to sniff at it. There was a horrible sucking sound, and the blue, misty-like stuff floated up from his father's head and into the void of the monster's mouth. In seconds, Josh's father was gone. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting the same fate. But after seconds turned to minutes, he opened his eyes. He was still alive. And his father's body was gone. All that was left of it, some speckles of blood on the leaves. The monster was gone as well. Then the realization set in. It was done with him. It wasn't going to kill him. He didn't have to worry about that. Because it was done with him. He thought back to the trail of blood Becca had left. The way it had impaled her, and where. The way it had kept him screaming. Josh wasn't ever going to be food. He was bait. His name is long forgotten. Now, he is known only as the Mokoi. But he was a man once, a long, long time ago. It is said that he was an Aboriginal tribal sorcerer, a man in tune with the greater powers of the world. But what did he choose to do with this great gift? He sought out the most powerful being in all creation, the devil of the southern land, the Bunyip. When he finally got his orders, the Bunyip rose from the depths like a great titan, and he asked why he had sought him out. Because none had ever been so stupid before. The sorcerer tried to humble himself. He told the Bunyip that, as it is the most powerful being in all existence, it would only be logical for him to serve him. The man, this sorcerer, probably thought he was a smart little cookie. But unlucky for him, the Bunyip is far more clever. You see, the Bunyip was no stranger to empty words, and was almost brought to his own version of laughter at the very notion that he would ever need someone to serve him. He was a being that could make the sky ripple like it was water. He doesn't need help for anything. What on earth did this arrogant little man think he could offer? No. It was plain as day the man was trying to ingratiate himself with the devil of the southern land. Being able to see into his very being, the Bunyip knew that he had schemed to get into his good graces, to the point where he thought that the Bunyip would reward him with even greater powers and otherworldly gifts. The Bunyip thought long and hard. And if you knew where to look, you might even say he smiled. The Bunyip gave him a list of names and locations, told him that these were practitioners of black magic, people who worked against the Bunyip's interests. He told the sorcerer to seek them out and to kill them without mercy. Then he would be given a reward. So the sorcerer set out, and over the course of only a few weeks, he had successfully killed all who the Bunyip had told him to. But when he returned to the Bunyip, the creature twisted his body, corrupted his powers, removed his ability to speak, breaking his jaw and tearing out his tongue from the root. The Bunyip wanted him to spend the rest of his pitiful life disfigured, deformed, mute, and cast out for ever daring to waste his time. This after making sure that the man had hunted down and killed all those who might have had some chance of undoing this curse. But the Bunyip did leave the man with one gift, however. He explained that he would now have the chance to be immortal, if he so wished. All he would need to do is consume the souls of others. But souls are like fruit. You want them in their prime. Too young or too old and they won't be ripe. If he was unwilling to feed in this manner, however, he would simply wither away to nothing. But the Bunyip reminded him that death may not be the end, and should he die, he might have release, or he might just have an eternity in the Bunyip's keeping. And with that, the Bunyip left the man to his fate. If he was brave enough to die, it might be over. Might. But if he was too scared, he'd have to be a butcher until the end of time. Over time, the Mokoi learned that it wasn't impervious to damage. Thus, it figured out that it couldn't just rush into a village or a tribe and take the rikest men and women. It would need to be clever. Otherwise, it might get torn into bloody ribbons. So instead, it learned to lure, taking children in the night and making sure to leave enough of a trail so as to lead their parents deep, deep into the bush, where he could more easily suck out their souls and kill them. And to this very day, that is what the Mokoi does. So if you ever hear of a child going missing in the woods, perhaps you shouldn't go looking for them.